Hey, look at the clock! It's almost time for my favorite show! I almost missed it!
You know, it might not have been the best idea to have opened this series of Mega Man Legends videos with a Tron Bonne review, since I always intended to cover all three of them, but at least we can make it work chronologically, as it was basically a prequel to the two games that it spun off from. That isn't to say that there's not much interesting left to cover as we take 2 steps back. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There's a few release dates that we should put down before we move forward, as they're a measuring stick for all 3D games on consoles during the same generation as this game. Metal Gear Solid came out on September 3rd, 1998. Not long after that, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time came out on November 21st, 1998. These two games influenced pretty much everything that came out after them: cutscene direction, gameplay design, camera use. From that moment on, the book would have been written and everyone afterwards followed. Mega Man Legends came out on December 18th, 1997, and it's especially impressive in what it achieves as a full 3D action RPG, with heavy use of fully voiced cutscenes.
Hey, you! Thanks to you, everything's a mess now, isn't it?
Huh? Aren't you the girl who's being chased by that dog?
Shut up! I don't want to hear about that! Do you know what you've done?
Huh?
You're a lot dumber than you look. You should have known better than to pick a fight with the Bonds. Of course, if you agree to become one of my servants, I suppose I could forgive you. What do you say? That way my brother will never have to know about what you did to us.
Join up with pirates? I don't think so.
All right then, forget you. Fine, see if I care. I gave you a chance and you turned it down. Don't come back crying to me later. Your history! You're toast! Just you wait!
Mega Man Legends follows Mega Man Volnut and Roll Casket, a digger and spotter duo who, after a successful dig, have their aircraft malfunction and crash on an island. Stranded there, they decide to try and find a way to fix the ship, which puts them in the way of the Bond pirates, who are on the island looking for treasure they believe is hidden under the island.
You alright?
You just mind your own business!
Okay, so before we get started on the gameplay in Legends, let's get a few things out of the way. I mentioned this in the Misadventures of Tron Bonne review, and the same holds true here with some minor adjustments. In Tron Bonne's game, you had a beginner and expert control mode and were prompted to choose one early on. Legends doesn't give you this choice, but the options menu has the exact same settings in there, in more direct wording. You can choose between having left and right on the D-pad function as strafing, or the shoulder buttons as turning, or the other way around, so move left and right with the D-pad and strafe with the shoulder buttons. If you change these from the default, putting strafing on shoulder buttons, the game feels a lot better to play for modern audiences. Combat in Mega Man Legends is fine, if a bit simple. Though maybe that's due to having a more modern perspective on it now. You've got a regular buster attack with a buster that can be upgraded with various items you get along the way. More on that later. There's secondary weapons, which I didn't really use much until fairly late into the game. It's not that they're bad, I just didn't have much use for them until the enemies started tanking more hits and rushing in more aggressively. For the most part, the better part of the fights can be done by circle strafing around enemies while holding down the fire button. Unless you're in a small corridor, in which case you strafe left and right to dodge attacks while holding attack. I know it doesn't sound too engaging, but the enemy designs are pretty varied. Some enemies have shields so you can't attack them from the front, some are stationary turrets that fire repeatedly in the same direction as base obstacles, some enemies rush you and lunge at you, some throw grenades, there's a few that fire projectiles directly at you. You still have to stay aware of your surroundings and pay attention to what kind of attacks enemies have rather than blindly strafe on end. But strafing is pretty effective. There's also a dodge roll if you move to the side and jump, which more often than not I ended up just doing by accident while trying to circle strafe and jump. I never found too much use for this move, to be honest. What's very impressive, especially for a game that came out as early as this, is the lock-on system in place. You have a button to look around, and when in combat, looking around locks you to the nearest enemy while rooting you to the ground. It helps track enemies if they're not in front of you, like some of the annoying aerial ones. It's a quick and simple targeting system, and it's pretty close to how a lot of games would end up later implementing it. Except most of these games implemented it after Ocarina of Time gave them the idea to do lock-on. Mega Man Legends was a year early to the game. The part where it gets crazy is that the game also soft locks onto enemies when they're in close enough range. You don't have to lock onto enemies to hit them successfully if they're not completely in front of you. The game knows and directly fires from the correct angle instead. There's no strange homing curve to the animations here. It's very clearly locking you to the enemies and correcting your shots for you. It's really impressive to have a game this old figure out the use to having a difference between a hard and soft locking onto enemies. And again, it's not a homing attack type deal, because homing attacks also exist as a separate deal with your secondary weapons. During your adventures, you find upgrade parts for your Buster, each improving different stats, like firing rate, attack power, range, projectile speed. You don't just equip another Buster in the game, but rather swap out two parts to mix and match bonuses between the two. I can appreciate weapon equipment going a step beyond just equipping new weapons for bigger attack value, and Mega Man Legends does that. I usually just focused on keeping my attack as high as it could go, but some fights in the game required me to have more range, so I would have to swap accordingly. It's simple, but it's a pretty good system, better than most games at the time. The combat isn't perfect by any means, as the game is still a product of its time. The strafing strategy works a bit too frequently on too many enemies, though how much that is an issue is really up to you. I know modern From Software fans are probably thrilled to see combat as refined and in-depth as their favorite series having existed elsewhere for so long. And saying something is a product of its own time is not as negative as a lot of people think. Doom is a product of its own time, and Doom is fantastic to this day. Mega Man Legends has a fairly clunky feel to its controls, which can't be helped being a full 3D game before proper analog controls. It takes some getting used to that feeling of jumping in the game, especially since you don't really start off with your full jumping height unlocked, forcing you to jump against really low-hanging ledges and climbing the rest of the way up a lot, even when it looks like you should be able to just jump on top of them. There's also an issue the game can have if you play it emulated, where sometimes the voices don't load in fast enough and the first second of the clips get skipped.
Hold it right there! You can't go in there! This area's closed off!
Please, officer, let us through. Our grandfather's in there and...
I had that issue recording for this review. Interestingly enough, it only happened in moments where there's voice acting with text boxes on the screen. And when it started to happen, only a few of the lines would get clipped off before everything played fine again. I haven't had this issue in the past, so I don't know what caused it this time, but it might be good to be aware of this problem possibly happening if you emulate it. I was a good way into the game before I noticed this, and I had no intention of restarting, since it didn't really mess with the more important scenes, and it wasn't my first time playing the game either, so I was fine with it.
Mega Man, were you able to find anything? Oh. If you can't find any parts in town, I guess we'll have to try digging for them ourselves.
Mega Man Legends has a lot of charm in a lot of areas. The graphical style itself is really good and holds up remarkably well. There's noticeable graphical issues, like how objects often clip into the background, like Mega Man himself has a liking to do when standing in front of some objects, which was likely the price to pay for the black magic must have taken for a PlayStation 1 game to do this with fairly low amount of loading times compared to most games. I usually make it a point to cut out the loading times in my footage while editing to have the gameplay flow better, because it isn't nice to sit in front of a black screen for several seconds every few seconds, as you often find yourself with the PlayStation 1. I haven't made any of these sorts of cuts in this footage. The game just loads fine, which is great after having reviewed Tomba recently.
Teasel, you better not be eating that entire pizza yourself. Huh? Hey, you! Do you know what happened to us thanks to you? I thought I was going to die! Huh?
You're alive! That's wonderful!
Let go of me! What do you think you're doing? Don't touch me!
What's the holdup, Tron? If you don't hurry up, there's not going to be any pizza left. Huh?
There's a lot of really cool details in the game, like how when you first fight the Bonds, the city can get destroyed during the fight, and it stays destroyed afterwards too. Rebuilding only starts after you donate money for repairs to the mayor afterwards. There's also this, which I'm sure everyone who has played the game knows about. So what some people might not know is that there's a morality system hidden in Mega Man Legends where your armor turns darker if you do bad things. Kicking a can at the lady working at the bakery is pretty mean, so that counts as a negative, as does kicking dogs. I'm not soulless enough to have footage of that though. Fixing up the city and defeating enemies changes your color back to normal. The shift is usually so gradual, most people don't immediately notice. Though, I remember as a kid, I thought it was because I bought armor in a shop and that was what it looked like now that I was upgraded. The game doesn't really tell you about this morality system, so how was I supposed to know? The cutscene direction is phenomenal, especially for the time. A year later, every major game would want full 3D cutscenes that were voice acted to look cinematic and cool with the advent of Metal Gear Solid. And even Metal Gear Solid made characters talk by shaking their heads up and down a bunch. The expressiveness behind the animations is spectacular for the PlayStation 1 in general, but especially for 1997. In a lot of respects, it outdoes a large percentage of games the generation after. You can downplay the facial animations by seeing their 2D sprites on a 3D model, but the amount of facial textures the games use would still be considered really high if a game did it these days. Not to mention the clever way the game fakes making the mouths look 3D with side angles. It's really impressive stuff. Speaking of being ahead of its time, there's moments where you're exploring the dungeon and you get radio calls from Roll to fill you in on things.
Remember the first time you went on a dig, Mega Man? I wasn't used to being a spotter, and you ended up getting lost underground for 3 days. Remember? We're lucky that Gramps came to help us. I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't been there.
After a while, these calls don't interrupt gameplay. You're allowed to listen to these calls while resuming play, which started becoming a really popular way of relaying information to players a generation later, when it became more normal to have a lot of voice acting in games. Something I also really like is that there's a number of smaller dungeons on the island that you stumble your way into with a number of treasures in them, that then later on turn out to all be interconnected when you start getting some upgrades that let you explore them more directly. I kind of feel like this is what Phantom Hourglass should have been doing for its big dungeon instead of making you go through the same floors on repeat. Giving you tons of tiny chunks of a dungeon scattered through a game before suddenly removing the boundaries between them and realizing each and every one of them is part of a mega dungeon is a lot cooler than just making you go back to the same dungeon on repeat. Mega Man Legends is a gem in the rough. There's a lot to like here if you give it a proper chance. Its biggest hurdles are the controls and the overly simple nature of combat. The final boss ramped that up well enough, though I would have liked to see more of that. If you stick with it, you get a charming adventure that holds up pretty well in some surprising ways, so long as you avoid the Nintendo 64 version. Anyway, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'm still kind of sick. I started getting sick when I was working on the Rocket Slime video, and I'm over the worst of it now, but I can still kind of feel it in my throat, so I hope my voice isn't too distracting this video. It actually kind of bothered me the last one when I listened back to it. I could hear that it was starting. After this, there's a game that I really want to play. I was putting it off until an emulator got far enough to allow a certain feature to be added, so I could play it properly the way that it was always intended, and well, it turns out we're here now. So yeah, we're gonna review a certain game very soon, and I am really excited to finally play this game properly. A few people who know me know what game I'm talking about. I've tweeted about a certain emulator adding a certain thing recently, so as always, this video has been brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the people you see scrolling on the screen right now, head over to patreon.com/aboveup, and I will see ya.